This particular piece of work done on issues around the reintegration of Indigenous prisoners. This covered, because we got for this data from all Australian jurisdictions, and obviously a fairly major exercise to get this. We got data from correctional services right across Australia, covering all male prisoners who'd been convicted of offence involving violence who were released over a 2-year period. So those data on 9,000 prisoners. We conducted interviews with stakeholders. This report is available in the full RPP version and the snappy little trends and issues version as well, all available on that. So we also covered interviews with prisoners and ex-prisoners, stakeholders involved in reintegration programs, picking up their perceptions of issues with those programs and service deliveries, and identifying possibilities for improvement of those programs and barriers to Indigenous reintegration. The data side of that looked at readmission to prison and recidivism, and basically see here that after 6 months, 24% of the Indigenous prisoners had been readmitted to prison, compared with 12% of the non-Indigenous prisoners. At the end of a 2-year period, more than half the Indigenous prisoners had been readmitted, compared with just over 30% of the non-Indigenous prisoners. So that echoed some earlier research and research done with other populations, which basically shows the extent of recidivism. That's a neat little survival analysis curve, which kind of shows the same thing, and basically the lines there are across the period of time since release, the proportion of the prisoners who are remaining in the community, so haven't been readmitted. So it's kind of a survival analysis, because survival in terms of remaining out of custody. As we can see here, so for Indigenous prisoners, your chances of staying out of prison dropped off much more quickly, and were much greater than non-Indigenous prisoners. The other thing that research found is they looked at issues around program and service delivery from reintegration programs. Across these 4 broad themes, like meeting Indigenous specific needs. So basically, out of all these interviews, what we found was there was a great need to develop more culturally appropriate programs and activities to achieve reintegration. These are programs, prison rehabilitation programs, post-release programs, and community-based programs as well. Great need for programs to be able to incorporate language, given that the very high numbers of Indigenous Australians for whom English might be their second, third, fourth language after a number of Indigenous languages. That was certainly a barrier, the ability for some prisoners to understand English language materials. Participation, generally lower rates of participation in a lot of, especially the prison programs, for Indigenous prisoners, and a lot of that was around those barriers of cultural appropriateness, and also around grief and loss issues that were affecting people to the extent they weren't able to, they weren't at a point where they could participate in offending programs. One of the really strong findings to come out was those kind of grief and loss and trauma issues needed to be dealt with first before people could then move on. And Indigenous involvement in terms of getting Indigenous facilitators and elders and so on involved in the programs. Across from family and community, there was a strong view that families and communities need to be much more involved in the reintegration process, and corrective services and other agencies need to find ways of involving family and communities. And it's a slightly fraught thing in some ways, in that often communities are harmed by offending, of course, and families may be victims as well. So how you actually manage that is not a simple process, but there's certainly that desire to have that. Other factors, in fact, as I say, grief and loss, the extent of disadvantage, which if you take someone from a very disadvantaged position which has contributed to their offending, return them to the same position, guess what? Unless you can actually deal with some of those issues of disadvantage, you can't change those contributors to offending behaviour. So, as a huge barrier to reintegration. Isolation, particularly in remote communities, the extent of services that are there and the ability of corrective services and other agencies to actually be able to deliver programs to people is really hampered. Something simple as, if you're living in a community 400 or 500 kilometres drive from the nearest major centre, but you're on parole and you're expected to report for parole, and you're expected to report to that major centre, and you don't have access to a vehicle or anything else, all of those things become major issues. So, corrective services are working at building ways around that, but there's still problems. And problem of short sentences. If you get people receiving short sentences or on periods of remand, which many Indigenous prisoners do, they just don't receive services or support during that time. There's not time for it, and it's prioritised on those people with longer sentences. And simply resources affecting corrective services agencies as well to be able to deliver the breadth of services needed. I'm going to sort of skip through this fairly quickly. Another one of the things we did was look at risk factors for victimisation. That brought together data from a whole range of sources, police data, other published reports and surveys, and basically there's quite a lot of information out there, but hasn't necessarily been integrated before to give you, and that's what we're trying to do, give sort of a fuller picture of these risk factors by drawing together all this other information. So I've kind of covered off really what the main risk factors for victimisation that were found. Alcohol use is a strong contributor. Experience of social stresses, things like having someone in your family sent to prison, having experienced violence, having suffered the death of a family member. These are the things that affect Indigenous Australians as a proportion more than non-Indigenous Australians and have been found to directly contribute to offending. Sex with victimisation. Basically across most areas of crime offending, males tend to be victimised more than females in the overall population, especially around violence. Mostly men tend to thump each other. In Indigenous communities, females experience basically the same levels of victimisation as men, which means compared with non-Indigenous females, experience much, much greater levels of victimisation. Around violent victimisation, in some jurisdictions it's sort of 2 to 3 times as much, in others it's 15 times as much. One of the worst things I found was that if you looked at hospital data from Queensland, South Australia, the Northern Territory and Western Australia, an Indigenous woman was more than 44 times as likely to receive hospital treatment for an assault-related injury than a non-Indigenous woman. So 44 times is fairly out there. Age, basically know from most areas of criminology that there's peak offending ages, people around the kind of 15 up to about 30 or so age range tend to do most of the offending in the community. Indigenous communities, there's a much lower age profile, a much different age profile compared with non-Indigenous communities, and what you basically end up with is a much higher proportion of the community in those peak offending ages, and that's linked to a whole lot of issues around life expectancy and health outcomes, and the age at which people have children and so on. But basically, you end up, and that's one of the big contributors, much more people in the peak offending group. And contact with the criminal justice system. So basically it's a nice little kind of vicious circle thing. One of your biggest risk factors for having contact with the criminal justice system is having previously had contact. Indigenous Australians are much, much more likely to have been charged with an offence as a child, and people who have been charged with an offence as a child are in turn much more likely to have further contact with the system later, and much more likely to have had previous periods of imprisonment as well. And basically once you get one, it kind of predicts that you're likely to have more